So you'll be able to revisit today's presentation. Also, this is a one-way webcast, so you can't speak, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type your question into the question box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's webcast is being sponsored by Tony Mullen's Advanced Sales and Marketing Summit. It's happening on June 27th and 28th in Jupiter Beach, Florida. There are links in the emails that we've sent to register for the summit. It should be a great time, and coincidentally, it turns out that both Cindy Longfellow, who's one of my co-presenters today, and I am going to be there. So if you don't get enough of us today, you can revisit the ideas we talk about at Tony Mullen's Advanced Sales Summit. This is me, Katie Roper, Caring.com's Vice President of Sales and Marketing. I'm joined today by two fantastic colleagues of mine. Shannon Ingram is Head of Sales and Marketing for Anthem Memory Care, a rapidly growing memory care provider with how many communities now, Shannon?
10.
10, okay. And Cindy Longfellow has been with Juniper Communities for a long time. She heads up their sales and marketing initiatives, although I'm told she doesn't really have a title, so because Juniper doesn't do titles. And Cindy is working right now on one of my favorite projects ever in senior housing. She's taking a bunch of her residents to Burning Man this summer. So I'm a big fan. I have made a note to myself that when I need it, I'm moving into one of Cindy's communities.
And we'll take you to Burning Man, Katie.
Excellent. Quick commercial here for Caring.com. The host of today's webinar, we're the #1 senior care resource. We publish lots of content about all different aspects of senior care, and 3 million people a month come and visit our site. They read our reviews posted by consumers. They read our articles. They look within our directory for senior care options in their area, and we screen them, qualify them, and send them out to our partners. Okay, what we're going to do today is I'm going to take you through some data about how decisions are made in senior housing sales by both adult children and the prospective residents. And then we're going to have an interactive session with Cindy and Shannon, where first I'll ask them a few questions that came up when we did this talk at the Argentum Sales Conference in Denver last week. And then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So why worry about multi-generational marketing? It turns out that adult children are involved in something close to 3/4 of all senior housing decisions. I've seen lots of different stats on this. This is one that I happened to write down from ASHA in 2014, but there have been a lot of other numbers like this that get thrown around, and they're all in the mid-70% range for the percentage of senior housing decisions that involve an adult child. So there are clearly two parties going on here, and a smart marketer is going to pay attention to both of them. What Caring sees is that when the person who submits a lead form on our site is an adult child, where the relationship is I'm looking for a parent or an in-law, there's a 3 times higher move-in rate versus people looking for themselves. And that holds true both for AL and for IL move-ins. For assisted living, the move-in rate is 2.5 times higher if it's an adult child. And interestingly, for independent living, the move-in rate is 3.5 times higher when the inquirer is an adult child. So even for older people who are still pretty independent, having an adult child involved in the decision means that it moves along more quickly. On a slightly more qualitative dimension, Caring.com does a lot of studies, and last summer we did a study of the caregiver journey where we identified people searching online for senior care and asked them to complete a survey. We had over 2,000 people complete one of our online surveys. About half of them were adult children, 30% were spouses, and 20% were searching for themselves. But Caring.com really talks mostly to the adult children. So I wanted to see how the data held up when you were talking to the resident or prospect. And I was alerted to a study that has just come out from Varsity Branding. This is looking at residents and prospective residents for CCRCs. So these are the seniors themselves. These are healthy and independent people who are considering moving into a life care community. Varsity's study was a combination of in-person focus groups and online surveys, and they pulled their data from both of them. I'm going to show you both of these studies. I apologize, it gets just a little bit complicated because there are two different studies going on, and we didn't coordinate these in any way. But I'll do my best to explain which one's which, and the amazing thing is how similar the conclusions were from Caring.com talking to adult children and Varsity talking to seniors. So let's start out with a question: what prompted the move? Here's what Caring.com found when we asked adult children, what prompted your loved one's move to senior housing? And this is split just for the answers that adult children gave. So this is not looking at self, and it's not looking at spouse. This is looking at adult children. Overwhelmingly, it was a health consideration that drove the move to senior housing. Almost 60% of the decisions had a health component to them. The next highest trigger factor for a senior housing move was the needs of the caregiver, him or herself. So the adult child was no longer able to care for the loved one, or they something else came up and their needs changed, and they had to make the decision to move mom or dad into a community. All of the socialization factors played a relatively low role in the adult children's decisions. So loneliness, death of a spouse, all much more minor considerations. And interestingly, financial considerations drove a very small percentage of move-in decisions. Now let's look at what happens when a resident decides to move. So this is the Varsity Branding data. They were talking, as a reminder, they were talking to residents and prospects of a life care community, so the seniors themselves. And again, far and away, the biggest driver of the senior housing decision was a health change. They broke theirs out by a health change in your spouse or a health change in you yourself. And in both cases, it was over 44%. So combine these two, and it's, you know, in the same ballpark as the 60% that Caring.com found. Home maintenance responsibilities were the next category, driving a decision by a healthy, independent senior to move into a life care community. And again, all of the socializations, desire for social interaction, availability of meals, there were some other things on this survey, but they were all much, much lower, well below health considerations. And then home maintenance responsibilities and not wanting to deal with them was the next one. So surprising similarity between the decision drivers for adult children and the decision drivers for prospective residents. The other thing that both surveys asked was how you made the decision. So here's Caring.com again talking to the adult children, and we asked them which tools did they use to select a community. In 40% of the cases, the adult children said that they had local knowledge of senior housing options. That means that in 60% of the cases they didn't. So if you're expecting an adult child to just know about your community and find it on his or her own, you might want to think again. Obviously, recommendations from friends and family members was just over 30%, but interestingly, the two online options, one being online directories like Caring.com and one being the community's own website, were used by just under 30% of people in making their decisions. This says that a smart marketer is going to do both. You're going to make sure you've got a great website that showcases your brand, and you're going to make sure you have a great presence in online directories. They're both getting used. Here was another really shocking statistic that came out of our survey. Only 17% of adult children making a senior housing decision had gotten a recommendation from a professional, a medical person, a clergy person. So all of those sorts of professional referral sources that have been such a big driver for so long of senior housing decisions are really dropping in terms of how important they are. Another really interesting stat was in the adult children's world, only 8% of their loved ones were the ones who chose the facility. In all the other cases, it was the adult child who selected and vetted the community that their parents ended up moving into. So now let's look at the same question from the Varsity Branding survey. Again, this is talking to residents of life care communities in the Varsity Branding Project Looking Glass survey. Here we find 65% of people stopped by communities they already knew. So that's a big uptick from the 40% of adult children who already knew about the community, and that's not surprising. If you are the age when people sell their big houses and move into senior housing, you're probably going to know a lot of friends and acquaintances who've made the same decision. But again, look at this. 41% of the seniors themselves searched online for senior communities as part of their decision process. Varsity Branding asked only about an online search. They didn't split it into directory searches versus community website searches, but together 41% of people had some component of online as part of their search decision. Again, a really important piece of your marketing mix. Another very interesting question, survey results that came out of the Varsity Branding study was they asked what factors were important in making the decision. And for life care community decisions, the financial stability of the community was overwhelmingly the most important element, the most significant factor in people making their decisions, followed closely by the expertise and friendliness of the staff. And those three things were more than double the next most important factors in driving this decision. Another very interesting thing was the non-factors. For people making decisions to move into a life care community, religious affiliation was a non-factor in over 30% of those decisions. The attractiveness of the grounds or the building was a non-factor in almost 40% of those decisions. So all that money you spent on nice chandeliers and beautiful landscaping, you know, people aren't really that concerned about it. This one was completely shocking to me. 14% of the time, friends living in the community was a non-factor in making the decision. There's another category of people who answered both Caring Survey and the Varsity Branding Survey, and those were adult children of non-residents. So these are people, this is caring data again, and these were people whose parents had decided not to move into a community. And we asked them why not. In almost half the cases, it was some variant of my parents would never consider it. In almost 40% of the cases, regardless of what their prior decision had been, the adult children said, well, they haven't agreed yet, but they're heading that way and they think it's going to be soon. Financial constraints were the cause of only 22% of people deciding not to move to a community. Another interesting stat from Caring's Caregiver Journey Survey, adult children whose parents still live independently in their own homes were the least satisfied of any of our survey segments. Only 25% of people whose parents are still living independently are satisfied with the living situation. And people whose parents are living in a senior community were the most happy of any of our survey segments. We go into a lot more detail in this in a webinar that we did last fall, going through in excruciating detail the Caregiver Journey Survey. If you're interested, you can find that on our website, partners.caring.com. So now let's see what Varsity Branding found when they asked a similar question of seniors who had chosen not to move into a life care community. What is holding you back from making the move, they asked. 61% were just not ready. That's the kiss of death in senior housing marketing, that just not ready. 35% had financial concerns. 28%, it was something in the domain of stuff. You know, I have too many things. I couldn't consider moving. It's too overwhelming to think about making a change because of all the things I have. And then 26% were very concerned about losing their independence. So there you go, the top 4 considerations for seniors in thinking about making a move to a senior community. This also, I thought, was really interesting. You can see the quote from Varsity Branding summarizing their findings. Bottom line, the belief is still prevalent that you move into a retirement community when you are sick, disabled, and or need help. And that's not really what senior housing operators want. We want people to move in when they're still healthy and independent, partly because they live in the community longer, but also because those are the people who really add vibrancy and excitement to a community and make it feel like home. So in looking at the data, I drew 4 conclusions here. The first is that health considerations drive most senior housing decisions, whether you're an adult child or a prospective resident. Seniors fear of losing their independence, and that's a really powerful objection. Adult children find that their own needs are driving many of the decisions, and so you need to help them feel that that's okay. And both surveys found that once people make the move, they're much happier. Both the residents are happier and their adult children are happier when they've made the move to senior housing. So now what I'd like to do is bring in Shannon and Cindy and talk a little bit about what you find. And maybe, Shannon, you want to start us off, and you're obviously marketing memory care, where the adult children have a really significant role, but maybe talk a little bit about how you think about these two groups in your marketing activities.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katie. Well, one of the things that I use is quite extensively is my own experience as a caregiver. I'm an adult child who had a career in technology and travel marketing, and I left my career to go work as a caregiver for my parents, which I did for 5 years, and oh boy, what an experience that was. Because of course, when I did that, it was because of an event. My mother was suffering from vascular dementia, and my father couldn't handle it anymore. There had been a fall. All of the things that we hear about adult children having to deal with. And I ended up writing a book about that. And ultimately, when my parents entered a community, they moved into a community about 3 years after I started caring for them, because I just couldn't handle it anymore. I went to work in memory care. So I have had an extensive digital career. I left memory care and went into digital marketing because I wanted to understand these adult children like myself, how we're making decisions that affect senior housing and care. And I had the good fortune to work with Katie for a while at caring.com. What I discovered is that digital marketing is here to stay. Not everyone is using it, of course. Some people are still needing to follow the original path of gathering information from communities themselves. But truly, the way I find works best for marketing to adult children who have had some kind of an event and are beginning to consider helping their parents find another place to live in seniors housing is that stories matter. Social proof, namely social media, testimonials, reviews online, those things matter, and so do the stories. You have to use those stories strategically. You're dealing with boomers, and I had some statistics I shared last week. These are from late 2014. 41% of Facebook users are boomers. 48% of Twitter users are boomers, and 53% of Pinterest users are boomers. That's still the fastest growing demographic online. Not all boomers are there yet, but they are. And as we saw in Katie's statistics, many of those boomers are still the adult children. We still have to be very, very considerate of millennials and Gen X. Gen X is coming on strong right now in placement, but that social proof is important. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Katie, and possibly Cindy.
Cindy, well, thanks, Shannon. And Cindy, I know you've been really active in social media. Talk a little bit about how you're using that both to reach adult children and also to reach the prospective residents.
Great. Happy to do that, Katie. You know, Shannon mentioned stories, and one of the things that we've found on social media, and we're very active on Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, and Pinterest, and we absolutely can see some differences in who of our demographic, the boomers versus Gen X versus the elder themselves, who's most active on those channels. But one of the things that seems to be very consistent across all of our audiences in social media is, as Shannon already mentioned, the value of stories. You know, we know that people will forget data and details and outcomes, but they don't forget a good story, like Shannon's story about her mom and placing her mom. We know that stories engage people much more deeply and really kind of open them up to then share their stories back. And so they really help us illustrate how senior living, whether it's a memory care community, standard assisted living, home health, that we can serve as the experts to really help them in their decision-making journey. And what we've seen on social media is that of all the types of content we post, and we do post things like outcomes data monthly, or like a shared story about, or a shared, I should say, article about research or something like that. But the things that get the most play for us on social media are the stories. Whether it's a resident story, we just had a resident who turned 107. We got a lot of action around that. Or whether it's a family story about their journey in making a senior living decision. So I absolutely concur about the value of stories. The other thing that we find gets us a lot of play on social media as well as on our website is mission and values and culture. And we might not think that our customers are really that concerned about our company or corporate mission and values, and yet they absolutely are. There was a recent article from Harvard Business Review that said that customers feel most engaged and buy more when they believe that they share values with a given company. Essentially, they want to feel like they share a higher purpose with a business. And I think a good example of this is Tom's Shoes in the retail industry. So that's other content, another content source that's really positive on social media. But one of the things that we were asked last week is whether we at Juniper tailor specific content to different audiences, and we don't, other than the fact that we know that we have a little bit different audience on each of those social media channels. But what is often different is the level of engagement, commenting, sharing, liking, etc. That seems to be more prevalent amongst the boomers and the Gen Xers, not so much amongst the elders. They might be seeing the stories, they might like it, but they're less likely to comment or share. That's a gross generalization, but it seems to be true, at least on our channel.
Interesting. This is Katie. We had an expert working with us for a while at Caring who said that if you have 100 people, one of them will initiate a conversation in social media, 9 of them will comment when somebody else initiates a conversation, and the rest are lurkers. They'll read, yep, and they'll probably enjoy it, but they won't either start a conversation or comment on one.
Yeah, I would believe that to be very, very true.
Katie?
So, yeah.
This is Shannon. I wanted to just mention something else, too, that I heard last week at Argentum, and actually after Argentum at a small conference, that was told to me about marketing to adult children, that there are 3 things we always have to be conscious of when we're talking with them, because it's a different generation than the earlier ones, and that is, number 1, give up the result you're trying to accomplish. Give up the result. Just be with them. The second is stay in the present moment. So be very present in your listening when you've given up the result. And 3 is be curious. And I think that resonates with a lot of boomers. I've been talking to people this last week just anecdotally that it's a different way of working with people than just spilling our guts about how great our community is, which was obvious in the data that you just presented. This business of staying in the present moment with them, of giving up the result and being curious is very powerful for anybody who's on the sales and marketing side today. I think Cindy probably agrees with me on that.
Absolutely, and I think, Shannon, you and I have talked a lot about really that personalized and individualized approach to your sales and marketing process that really focuses on where a given individual, whether it's the elder or the adult child, where they are in that decision-making process. What is their level of readiness? And I think particularly speaking about being curious and being in the moment absolutely dovetails with that kind of an approach.
You know, Cindy, building on that, as we were preparing for this, I remembered going to an earlier Argentum conference a number of years ago now, but one of the things they did was they had a panel discussion with families who had made a move into a senior housing community. They had both the residents and the adult children, and one of the questions they asked of these panelists was, why did you pick the community that you picked? And something like 3 of the 5 families specifically mentioned that they chose the community they did because when they went on the tour, the salesperson paid attention to the older person, even over and above the adult child who was touring with them. And I found that very interesting. I'm wondering, you know, can you talk a little bit about any training or coaching that you do with your people to make sure that they are honoring the senior who's touring as well as the adult child who may be made the arrangements?
Sure, sure. And Shannon, I'd love to hear your perspective more on the memory care side, because I've worked on both, you know, in both environments, and it is a bit different. But in our sales training, we absolutely do teach to really maintaining a keen awareness of that elder and incorporating them into the discussions, into the discovery process, really understanding both their perspective and the adult child's perspective, recognizing that there may very likely be some discrepancy between those two perspectives, and really being cognizant of that and gentle around that as we walk through the sales process, and really hopefully beginning to draw those two perceptions of the value of senior living and what are the needs that can be met by senior living, really speaking to both that adult child and the senior to draw them together more closely as they're making that joint decision.
Yeah, and to just add to that, Cindy, to your comment about, or your request to cover memory care, I think a really important part of memory care is to remember that this person that the adult child is seeking, or a spouse is seeking to place, is a person, a human being with a past that is just like anyone else's, if you will. They are seeking to have their parent treated with dignity and respect, even though they have memory impairing disease. So I would say it's always important to acknowledge this person and not speak in the third person. Use the loved one's name. Don't call them mom or dad. Use their name. You have it. So if Shirley is going to be happy. The other really important piece that I've incorporated for several years is when you're going to be seeing a potential resident along with the adult child, think about bringing that person into an engagement that's happening there and let them sit down with their child and experience the engagement on site. That's sometimes magical. So that's my thought about that.
Shannon, here's an interesting question that just came in. How would you handle situations where the adult child states that they feel that their parent is not as bad as others in memory care? And I'd like to build on that. How do you handle conversations that you may be having about medical needs, whether it's memory care or otherwise, when you're on the tour and you've got both parties present?
I think that's a really great question, Katie. And I would go back to the 3 things I just mentioned a few minutes ago. First of all, give up the result. You've got somebody there for a tour, and if they say they're just not ready yet, ask questions. Say, well, help me understand where you think that your mom is, or Shirley is if they're sitting there with you. What makes you think about where they are right now? I'm just curious as to what brought you here and how you feel about where she is at this moment. And then listen, because you're going to get the keys if they say, well, she's still extremely active. And this is in the case of memory care, but also as seniors, I remember feeling, I went to one community with my mom and felt that everybody there was sitting around in wheelchairs and they didn't look very healthy. And I told the gentleman that who was touring me, this is not for my mom. She can't do this. And he said, well, let's go back here. And we went to another area that was much nicer. However, I still felt that all those people that were gathered there in the wheelchairs, that it was not the kind of place where I wanted my mom to be. And so that's a clue that if you're going to have a tour, you can't always handle this when it's a walk-in. But if somebody is coming in, you want to be sure that people are engaged. We do this all the time at Anthem, and I know other memory care communities that do the same. Just work very hard to have some kind of fun engagement going on that allows people to see that even those who are confined to a wheelchair are still engaged.
Shannon, at Argentum, you told a wonderful story about the community that your parents actually did move into and how they were so upset on the day of the move.
Oh, yes. That's a great example. My parents actually were so upset. It was my mother more than anything who was so upset about having to leave her apartment. She'd been moved. We moved them out of their big home 5 years earlier, and now she didn't want to leave the apartment. And so she had my dad aligned with her to say that if we went through with the move, they would disown me and my sister and we would be cut out of the will. And that was a little threatening. However, we as a team, my sister and I decided this has to be done. So we planned the move, and it turned out to be on Valentine's Day. And my mom and dad sat in their bed all day with my little niece, who I think was 10 at the time, and watched TV and let us move everything out, and they were just so angry. And sometimes my dad would get up and come out to me and my sister and say, I'm really not mad, but I have to act really angry because of Mommy. So about an hour or two after we had gotten everything loaded up and sent the truck over to the community where they were going to be living, it was close to dinner time, and we walked in the lobby and they said, why don't you join us for dinner, the whole family? And as we walked down the hall, we could hear a band playing music. And there at the entrance to the dining room were the staff and a lot of young people who were apparently sent there to dance with the residents from UC Irvine. They volunteered, they weren't sent. And they handed my mom 2 roses, and she turned around and looked at me and my sister and said, oh, they're having a party for us. And that was the end of her resistance. Within 2 weeks, she was part of that community. She loved having new friends. And I've always used that story to illustrate how things can change for adult children who are absolutely burned out caregivers.
So building on that, one question that came up in the registration was, we got a question about, are there any tools that communities can provide to family members that they can use to help the older person kind of wrap their heads around this decision? Do either of you have any suggestions in that domain?
You know, we have a resource guide which is definitely geared more to the adult child or the decision maker, perhaps a spouse who is not necessarily the individual needing care, and there's a number of different checklists there and some resource material and so forth. But for the elder themselves, what I've found is it is all about the connection, and as Shannon has already said, the engagement. It's almost as if there needs to be that magic moment when, whether it's They stumble upon an activity that's happening in your community during a tour, such as an art project or musical event, but they stumble upon something that makes them feel like this could be home, or they make a connection with one of the other residents or team members in the community. But my experience has been, particularly with that potential resident themselves, there has to be a connection. There has to be that moment where their perception of who they are and what they need and the reality of what we offer sort of melds together. So we can give them resources, and certainly we have some of those, and I'm sure many senior living communities do, but it's really not about that in my mind.
Katie, I like to just say that I think, when you talk about having to engage people who are not ready or feel like there's too much stuff, I mean, that came up in your research, that this is going to be so hard, that one of the best ways to communicate that it's not is to create a video that's a short but simple thing to show how another adult child, and hopefully it's a real story that you have from your residents of how they were able to move their parents into a community, or maybe a grandparent. Gen X and millennials all want video. That's where they go to find out what they're going to do next, whether it's going to a food truck or a movie. And I think that particular way of communicating to people is underused still in our community. I also think another thing that's very important is to deal with the guilt, because a lot of times when someone's not ready or they don't want to move, it's the adult child feeling guilty and thinking that they made a promise to keep their parent at home, and that's where it really helps to have a sales and marketing culture that embodies your corporate culture. And in my company, we say, you know what we'd like you to do when you're thinking about your parent and this situation that you've said you can't keep her at home anymore, but you feel so horrible, is to remember that your promise that you made to keep them home is a spiritual promise. It's a promise from your heart, and what you're really wanting to do is keep them safe and engaged and have someone who respects their dignity. So that's the way you do. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Great. Okay, switching gears here, we had a question come up about brochures and pamphlets. We've been talking a lot about online stuff, online videos and things like that. Is there still a place in a senior housing sale in 2016 for a printed brochure?
Katie, this is Cindy, and that is a great question. And for better or worse, the answer is absolutely yes. There's still a segment of our respective demographics, whether it is still some boomers, oftentimes the senior themselves, who want that piece of paper, who want something that they can hold in their hands and they can spend time with and they can read and reread and look at. So absolutely there is still a need for brochures, trifolds, information sheets, maybe FAQs about process, whatever it is that you're using. You know, I think I mentioned to you, Katie, we know that we have people who have been all over our website and still ask for a brochure. And I think there's something about having that tangible piece of paper that you can refer back to that's very important to and perhaps comforting to some of our older boomers and seniors. And also, you know, it's a great next step in your sales process. It's one more piece of information that you can get in the hands of that reluctant decision maker.
Great. Talk a little bit. There were a couple of questions about what's the best way to communicate with people. Do you see a difference between how your salespeople communicate with the boomers and how they communicate with the seniors? And I'm thinking both, you know, the tactical things like texting and email versus phone calls, and the message things like what you say in those.
Yeah, I think, this is Shannon, and I think you definitely want to communicate via email with boomers. I mean, statistics have shown, I have a number of stats that show that search is the top online information gathering resource for boomer women, and that search drives a variety of actions. But people really, I mean, email is undervalued by Gen X and millennials, but it is still the key way of communicating, and texting is now coming up with boomers too. So you have to have your act together on how best to communicate, and one of the best things you can do is ask. That's that be curious. How would you like to hear from me? Do you want me to give you a phone call, or are you more interested in, if I have something to share, if I email you or text you? Cindy?
No, that was exactly what I was going to say, is we absolutely do see some generational differences there, but those are beginning to lessen. And so I think no matter what the age of the individual, you need to ask that question. How do you prefer that we reach out to you? And then write it down or document it in your IRM or CRM system, so that you remember how they want to be communicated with. It's almost worse than not asking the question if you ask the question and then violate that request.
Yeah. A quick question here, Shannon. You've mentioned a couple of times giving up the result, which I think is absolutely brilliant, but maybe you could take just a little bit more time and explain what you mean by that. What do you mean by giving up the result?
I will give you an example that just happened yesterday. This was a recommendation. These 3 points actually came to me from Jane Sallerson, whom many people know is with Sherpa, but she is also a former VP, Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Emeritus before they went in with Brookdale. And Jane spoke to a bunch of our community relations directors last week and gave us these 3 points. So yesterday, one of my community relations directors in the Denver area decided to use that with a tour that had come in and had been quite resistant initially, and she just let the idea of giving up the result is, okay, I need to give up the deposit today. I know that's what I want, but I'm going to let it go and just stay present with this woman and also be very curious about where she is, and just let go of the deposit. And guess what happened? By asking questions and talking and just enjoying the moment with this person touring, and not asking at the very end when they said, well, what's our next step? And she said, well, you know, would you like to make the deposit, because this room is available now? And without any, as she said, without any hanging on to that result, the person ended up making the deposit. So that giving up the result is giving up what you want right in that moment. You know that's what you want, but give it up and be present with the person to whom you are talking. And if in some ways, that's the essence of person-centered selling. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Shannon. This is Cindy, and we talk about not having a preconceived notion of where a given meeting or conversation will go. And for that same reason, we know that individual, again, whether it's the adult child or senior themselves, They are the driver. And so we need to allow them to tell us where they are, to tell us what their needs are. We get at that by being curious. But if we attempt to have a preconceived notion, or in your verbiage, Shannon, if we don't give up our result of that meeting, we may never get to any result that's satisfactory. And it's kind of that sort of zen in a way. It's, you know, letting go in order to get where you need to be.
Yep.
Yep. There's a question being asked, what are some techniques that will help overcome objections to seniors moving into an adult community? And based on what both of you have said here and some of the other things I've been reading and finding in my own sales initiatives, to think about overcoming objections is almost to have the result already in your mind, right? I'm going to get these people to think about this the way I want. And if you focus instead on just understanding the person, the objections sort of magically melt away.
Yeah, Katie, this is Shannon, and I always have 3 words on my, right near where I can see them at all times, not necessarily where anyone else can. Those 3 most powerful words to me in any sales process are, when you're confronting an objection, are help me understand XYZ. Help me understand why you're feeling that way.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, I am seeing no more questions here. So with that, I'm going to, well, we've already done Q&A. I am going to thank my panelists so much for joining us today, and invite everybody to the next in our Digital Marketing Academy webinar series on Thursday, June 16th. I'm thrilled that I'm going to be joined by Bankrate's Greg McBride, who Bankrate is Caring's parent company, and Greg McBride is regularly interviewed on all sorts of national TV shows. He's Bankrate's Senior VP of Analytics, I think he is, but he is going to talk about the state of the housing market in 2016. And of course, for many people, the decision to move into a senior community is driven by whether or not they can sell their house. So it should be a terrific program, and I hope you all will join us. Thank you. And watch your email. We will be sending out slides and a link to this recording. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Katie, so much.
Thank you, Katie.
Bye.